Alright, we're beginning segment 1 for Friday, and we pick up with Time for Teddy. So it's now time for Teddy Roosevelt to step onto the scene, and of course he becomes a dynamic national spokesman for progressive change. The question that we're looking at for a minute is how he rose to prominence so quickly. We had left him standing on San Juan Hill after the battle, actually saying that he thought we were within measurable distance of a terrible military disaster. But he will become very prominent, as we've discussed before, as soon as the war has ended. He goes back to New York, of course, and is victorious, and we've seen the pictures that people drew and painted and even took of him as the representative of the Spanish-American War in the minds of many people. So politically, there was really no question that he had a great future ahead of him if he chose to take it, and he did. He returned to his home state of New York, and the question was not if he would run for some office, but what party would he run for. Now, what's pretty interesting is that Roosevelt, although he will turn out to be a Republican, really had a lot of ideas, as we'll see, that were much more in line with the Democrats and their desire to regulate business and help the common man. But he chose to become a Republican in New York, mainly because he couldn't stand Tammany Hall, the city machine that controlled New York City, and also he was not a huge fan of immigrants because he connected them to the corruption of the political machine. So he chose to become a Republican, which in the minds of some conservative Republicans was actually something that was not really a good thing. So let's take a look at how he rose to power. First, he's elected to the position of governor of New York in October of 1898. So this is the same year that he fought at San Juan Hill. Immediately becomes a big problem for New York Republicans because as he becomes governor, he begins to regulate businesses in New York and especially go after the trusts in New York, which sounds a little bit like something a Democrat would do. But Roosevelt believed that trusts were okay as long as they didn't misbehave. So he believed that there were good trust and bad trust, as we'll see, and he would go after the ones that he thought were not behaving correctly. To pay back a favor to the Republicans of New York, McKinley removed his previous vice president, or actually it was after the death of his old vice president, from New Jersey, and instead put Roosevelt on the ticket. Again, a very popular move, but beyond that, the Republican Party of New York believed that they had come up with a way to get rid of him, which was to stick him in the one place where he couldn't do any damage, which was in the vice presidency. So they pushed hard for McKinley to do this. McKinley owed them some favors, but of course, much to the chagrin of the New York Republicans, Roosevelt will become president in September of 1901 when a demented anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz will assassinate McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. By demented anarchist, what that would probably translate to today would be somebody who was mentally ill but seemed to focus on the idea that government was bad in general and must be destroyed. You see a picture there of Czolgosz behind bars and a couple of recreations of McKinley being assassinated in September of 1901 at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. So this leads to Roosevelt becoming president, and when he took office, the predictions for big business were pretty dire. There was a sense that he would probably continue what he had done in New York. But as in his first term in office, he turned out to be relatively calm in his actions. He does a couple of things that are pretty important that presidents before him had not done, which were very progressive. And he pushes conservation, and that's the idea of conserving the environment. Now, it's a little different than environmentalism, which is what most people fall in line with today. The difference between conservation, which began actually a little bit before Roosevelt, but he definitely hopped on board and was a big part of it, and environmentalism is really the reason that you're trying to save the environment. Conservation was based on the idea that you want to save the environment so it will actually exist in the future, so it can be used at that point. So it's in essence, let's stash it aside so we can use it later. Environmentalism, which actually gets its big start from a book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, that's published in 1962, is the idea of saving the environment because if you don't, it will be destroyed and all of mankind will be destroyed. So a lot of times they do the same exact things, but it's actually a little bit of a different rationale behind it. He's well known for his work with the state parks. He was definitely an outdoorsman, very active guy. In fact, always seemed to be doing something. Even when he got older, his kids, a lot of people commented that he ran around as if he were a little kid. I think he's a little bit like somebody who ate too many sugar-coated breakfast cereals as a child. Very, very active, and we'll see how that plays out in his image. But as you can see here on the bottom right, it was the idea of the trust busting that a lot of people thought of when they thought of Roosevelt's presidency. He revised the Sherman Antitrust Act, revived it, which means that it was still in existence, but people weren't really using it. Remember, the Republicans had originally passed that in the 1880s, and to act as though they were doing something to rein in business when they really didn't want to. But he revived the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has a provision in it that says if a company is found to be in restraint of trade, which is a fancy way of saying if they're a monopoly, then the government could break them up and force them to split into smaller companies that had to compete against each other. He believed that there were good trusts and bad trusts, but he would make the judgment as to which one was which. In his first term, one of the first trusts he went after was a railroad trust held by J.P. Morgan, and he also went against the Swift & Company Beef Trust. Beyond that, more progressivism from Roosevelt included the square deal. Now, this is pretty interesting because it's a very typical Roosevelt action, and it gets the nickname the square deal, and because it's so popular, politicians from then on will come up with names for their programs that are similar to that. We'll have the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt, we'll have the Fair Deal with Truman, and we'll have the New Frontier with John F. Kennedy. And so you'll see that Roosevelt kind of was a trendsetter in that direction. In this particular case, the square deal really revolved around Roosevelt's response to a coal strike that was lasting for months. The entire coal industry was either very much slowed or shut down by striking workers. And it threatened to shut down a large portion of the entire economy because they all used coal as the basis for their production. But instead of doing what most presidents had done in the past, which was anytime there was a strike like this, they came down on the side of the big business and tried to destroy the labor union, which you would expect a Republican president to do. Roosevelt did something very different. He, in essence, took the two groups that were arguing, the labor unions and the coal ownership, and he told them that they better settle their problems, otherwise he would just take over the business as the government and run it as a government entity. So instead, as it says there, his subsequent demand that both labor and management submit the issue to binding arbitration was eventually known as part of the square deal. Never before had a union been put on the equal playing field with big business. So it makes sense that he would handle it this way, but the big change was he actually treated the unions as if they were a full and equal partner in what was happening. So ironically, it's a Republican president who is the first to really treat unions relatively well, and it was part of the conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and protecting consumers, which is the rationale he gave for threatening to nationalize or take over the coal industry, that made up the 3 C's of the square deal. And again, this is very progressive from a president who was part of the Republican Party, but each time he did something like this, many people in his party were unhappy with him, but he was too popular to kick out of office. That leads us to his second term. He runs for election on his own in 1904. He defeats the Democrat Alton Parker, as you see there on the map, and you can see the Solid South there. This is a very good indicator of the Solid South. It almost looks like the old Confederacy. At this point, the Democrats had given up on William Jennings Bryan, although he'll attempt to make an appearance again in the future. So Roosevelt wins his own term beginning in 1905, and we'll see a lot more progressivism. Things become much more progressive as a result of his re-election. We'll see the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is probably one of the most well-known and symbolic of the changes that occurs during progressivism. It attacked two problems that you're probably somewhat familiar with. Definitely the problem in the meatpacking industry that it was exposed by Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle, and if you're not familiar with it, within it describes the terrible conditions in the meatpacking plants, including the fact that there was almost no cleanliness, that there were rodents and other things running around, people getting injured in the machinery, and unfortunately at the end of each workday they would just sort of sweep up everything and put that in casing and call it sausage. And so it was something that made the American public very angry and demanding that the government do something about it. The other industry that it went after was what was called the patent medicine industry, P-A-T-E-N-T, patent medicine industry. And you see some examples of it there in the center picture. And all of these different medicines supposedly fixed everything you could imagine, but in reality they were just colored liquid that sometimes had sugar, sometimes had opium, but really did nothing that they claimed. And the reason that the products could claim to do all these things was that there was no regulation of it, so they just took advantage of the consumer. Well, putting these two very problematic things together, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed with his definite blessing the Pure Food and Drug Act that created the Federal Drug Administration or Federal Drug Agency, which actually monitors the production of pharmaceuticals, and then of course also monitors the production of American beef. The FDA, as you're familiar with, and when you buy beef today or you buy meat, you'll find an FDA sticker on there saying that it's been inspected, and in fact they will even grade it and tell you what quality it is. So there is quite a bit of oversight in both the medical field for all our medicines and the beef industry, and this is the beginning of a lot of regulation that we obviously have today. Roosevelt continues on and finishes out his term, and he will then decide it's time to step down as president, although he's definitely not stepping down from being active, but he's had enough of being president in essence, and so he will actually choose his own successor. Now, this is something that we've talked about before. A president who serves 2 terms can pick someone to take their place, and the American people will believe that in a sense it would be a 3rd term of that particular president. Roosevelt was not stopped from running by the 22nd Amendment because it wasn't around yet, but he had decided not to be president any longer. So he chose William Howard Taft to take his place. You can see a couple of cartoons here. And Taft will then run in 1908 against William Jennings Bryan, who's put back up again, and you can see it's again very much the solid South with a little bit of the Midwest. Bryan was from Nebraska, so he got a little of that, but Taft won 321 to 162, and Roosevelt will then leave the White House and Taft will take over. A lot of people believe that Taft would continue progressivism, especially Roosevelt himself. Taft actually passed more progressive legislation than Roosevelt had, but gets very little of the credit. TR and the progressive voters believe that the conservative or non-progressive wing of the Republican Party had sort of taken over Taft, and were angry that more stuff wasn't being done, even though in reality he actually did more than Roosevelt had actually done during his presidency. He didn't get a lot of the credit for it because he wasn't Roosevelt. And we've talked about before how it's almost impossible for somebody who follows a very popular president to overcome the shadow that's left behind, or the giant boots that are left behind by the person that tries to follow them. A little side note on Taft. Taft was actually very depressed because he had difficulty in the White House. He realized that Roosevelt was sort of angry with him, and he was really being pulled in opposite directions by the progressives of his party and the conservatives of his party. And in his depression, he began to eat, and so he became extremely overweight and was way over 300 pounds, and famously got stuck in the White House bathtub. And had to get wedged out because he was too large to get out of it. Interestingly, once he leaves the White House, he will later be appointed to the Supreme Court, and he will serve there, and he will be happier there, and he'll actually lose quite a bit of that weight. But as we'll see, probably the biggest problem that that Taft had was the popularity that Roosevelt continued to have even though he was no longer in the presidency, and we'll pick up with that in the next segment.